Hello, 你好, welcome back to Wisdom Wednesday with Johnny Tiger. I am Johnny Tiger. I am Canadian. I am Taiwanese. My heritage is Chinese. Why am I making a point of saying that? Well, you'll find out in a little while. The date is May 20th, 2020. 2020. That's awesome. Although I probably said this already back in April 20th and March 20th. So, anyway, won't dwell on that too much. This is week number 11 of the coronavirus staying at home, social distancing, saving the world by keeping away from people. And again, we are here for Wisdom Wednesday. Although I don't really feel like I got a lot of wisdom to share right now. Kind of tired, kind of hungry. So let's get it going. Today, I want to talk about something a little bit heavy, a little bit complicated. But I've been asked about this often enough that I feel it's a worthwhile topic to get into. I'm going to talk about the relationship of China and Taiwan and Japan. Why do Chinese people hate Japanese people so much? And why do Taiwanese people, for the most part, hate Chinese people more than we hate Japanese people? Uh, it's like a very complicated triangle relationship that went really bad. Now, I don't claim to be a scholar. I'm not very good with details. So if you're looking for specific dates and details and all the intricate stuff, I recommend you to Google what I talk about today and read up on them yourself. Uh, I am just here to give you the most basic version of events, making them easy to understand and easy to follow. I am not a historian. I'm not even all that smart, truth be told. But be that as it may, it is part of my country's modern history, and I think I am in a little bit better position than many people to talk about this and to understand this. So, where should we begin? We should go back to the first Sino-Japanese War. In the 1800s all the way to the 1900s, China really was having a rough time. At this time, China was still ruled by an imperial system. Uh, for those of you who are a bit like me and just not very good with politics and stuff like that, that means China still had a royalty and uh, emperor and kings and queens and all that stuff. But at that time, in the 1800s, the royalty in China were very corrupted. They were very weak. That resulted in China being invaded again and again by foreign powers. Now, I do feel very strongly about this, so I'm not going to get carried away talking about the different wars, but suffice to say, all these countries that we think of as heroes today were in there adding their abuse to China back then. USA, same thing. British, same thing. The Opium War was all about how British people were forcing Chinese people to buy opium from them. Contrary to popular belief, Chinese people did not invent opium. We did not indulge in opium until British people started to sell that to China. And when Chinese people refused to buy opium anymore because we didn't want our people to be addicted, we got invaded by the British. But that's digressing a little bit. So suffice to say, a lot of countries invaded China, took lands from China, took properties from China, killing Chinese people, raping Chinese women, and so on, for almost 100 years. In 1895, after losing yet another war to Japan, the Chinese emperor ceded the island of Taiwan to Japanese people as a peace offering. Now, that wasn't a big deal to them back then because honestly, most Chinese people back then didn't even know there was a place called Taiwan. It was just an offshore little island with very few people living on it. So they didn't think much of it by giving it to Japanese people. The peace lasted until 1937. Now, of course, a lot of things happened between 1895 and 1937. One of the biggest events was the overthrowing of the imperial system in China. People rebelled and said, we have enough of this crappy royal system, royalty ruling us and not doing their job. They keep losing wars against outsiders. We want a new system. So Chinese people banded together and overthrew the imperial. And that was the modern China born. But all wasn't peachy and happy because now we don't have an emperor. Now we don't have a king or queen. Who's going to rule? Who's going to be the ruling party? Here is where things started to split. We saw two different parties. One was the Chinese Democrats, who supported democracy, and one was the Chinese Communists, who supported communism and socialism and all that stuff. In the beginning, the two parties kept their fighting to a minimum. It was mostly political. They tried to work together. Sometimes they would fight, but there was not a lot of bloodshed at that time. For the most part, China was thrown into civil war because in among these parties, there were various forces that wanted to rule China. So just in the democracy, the Democrat camp, there were 8 different generals. Each had their own army. Each one wanted to be the new president. And they were constantly fighting each other. So long story short, China was very fragmented at this time because the old system was thrown out and the new system not settled in yet. And that's when Japanese people hit China. In 1937, Japanese people invaded China from the north. You can say that they snuck in. They came in under the guise of helping Chinese people restore their government. And then they started to take over different provinces, different cities. They started to take things by force. In the December of 1937, one of the greatest atrocity in human history happened. In the city of Nanjing, or in some people would know it as Nanking, it's either spelled Nanjing or Nanking, depending on what source you look for. But if you Google Nanking massacre, you will find all the information. So I won't elaborate on all the small details. Japanese people surrounded and took over the city of Nanking, and within 3 days, they murdered, raped, put to death, tortured an estimation of 300,000 Chinese civilians. None of these were military, none of these were soldiers. It was all civilians that Japanese people uh, went after, killed, murdered, raped, etc., etc. 300,000 people in 3 days. Now you just think about that for a quick second. In some smaller countries, that would be a genocide. That would wipe them out. In some smaller countries, even today, in some smaller islands or nations, that would be enough to wipe them off the face of the earth right there. 300,000 people in 3 days. All civilian. Now, that was obviously really, really bad. Bad enough that to this day, Chinese people cannot forgive the Japanese people for that one single act during the entire 8 year war. And yeah, it was an 8 years war. It went from 1937 and they invaded China, and Japanese people and Chinese people fought until 1945. Just to give you guys an example of how much Chinese people still hate Japanese people for what they did during the war. In the early 2000s, I believe it was 2003, 2004, there were two very notable news items that came out of China. Both heavily illustrate how Chinese people still feel nowadays about what the Japanese people did. The first incident happened in a McDonald's in China. Apparently, there was a big lineup in this fast food restaurant, and there was a Japanese tourist in the lineup. This Japanese tourist got impatient and started to raise his voice with the store clerk, with the cashier, demanding that because he was a tourist, he should be served. He should be able to get his food quicker. As soon as people heard that this guy was from Japan, the entire lineup of Chinese people jumped him right there in the restaurant, beat him down to the ground, and rather than calling the police, the restaurant owner ordered the door shut, and the workers, staff members, and the managers joined in the beating. They almost killed that Japanese tourist. And that is one of the examples of how much Chinese people still feel hatred towards Japanese people for what they did during the war. Another example, another even greater example of this hatred happened in about the same time in the early 2000s. About 20 Japanese dignitaries were in China for some kind of official business. While they were in their hotel, they decided to dial up some prostitute from an escort agency. Now keep in mind, in China, uh, prostitution was strictly illegal. When the escort agency heard that these were high-ranking Japanese officials that were going to be their customers, the girls showed up bringing with them police officers to arrest everybody. Now, why is this significant? Because for a prostitute to go to the police and say, hey, I'm a prostitute and I just got calls from this Japanese people, the police would arrest the prostitute along with the customer because prostitution was illegal. So by admitting that you were a prostitute, you are sacrificing yourself just to get the other party arrested. But these prostitutes felt so strongly about their culture, their people, about how evil the Japanese people were, that they were willing to go to jail. They were willing to admit to the police that they were prostitutes, so the police could arrest these high-ranking officials from Japan and put them on trial and embarrass their country in the process. Going back to 1945, the war finally ended. The Japanese people surrendered. And as part of their surrender, they gave Taiwan back to China. So this leads us to the next question. Isn't that a good thing? No, Taiwanese people now go back to belong to their own people, belong to China. Uh, we are all Chinese now that we are reunited. Isn't that a good thing? Well, it turned out that a lot of Taiwanese people thought the same way. A lot of people thought that finally we can be reunited with our own people. However, it was not as we imagined how things would be. When the Chinese government sent over their soldiers and their officials to reclaim Taiwan, Taiwanese people welcomed them with open arms. But the people that came over were not the people that we thought they would be. They were not here friendly, glad to see us, and ready to help rebuild the island. These were people that just finished fighting an 8-year war against the Japanese. Now, if you can imagine, to this point, Taiwan was under Japanese rule for 50 years, from 1895 to 1945. So Taiwan has been under Japanese rule for 50 years at this point, and just got given back to China. So a lot of structures, a lot of customs, a lot of habits, a lot of the way people dress, a lot of language people spoke were still heavily influenced by Japanese people. Schools, churches, office buildings all had Japanese design elements. So can you imagine for a second these Chinese people that just finished fighting a very long and cruel 8 years war against the Japanese came over to reclaim Taiwan, and they saw Taiwanese people dressing like Japanese people. They saw that Taiwanese building looked like Japanese building, and they heard that Taiwanese people spoke Japanese language. That was bad because now, in their eyes, these were not their people. They saw us, they saw Taiwanese people as sellouts, as traitors, as Japanese wannabes. These officials and military people came over and started raping and pillaging and taking things from Taiwanese people. They treated Taiwanese people worse than how Japanese people treated Taiwanese people. When Japanese people ruled Taiwan, they were strict. They could be cruel, but they were fair. If you worked, you could have your status. If you worked, you get paid. If you studied, you could get ahead in society. If you did good work, you get paid a lot of money. They put in a lot of effort building up the island, building up the economy. It was said that when Japanese people ruled Taiwan, you didn't have to lock your door at night because their laws were so strict that no criminal dared to commit crime. It was said that when Japanese people ruled Taiwan, the government officials were so fair that no one took bribes, and no one would abuse their power because of how strict the laws were. So imagine the Taiwanese people were used to this strict but fair system, and then they finally saw the Japanese people leave, and then the Chinese people came over, and we thought we were welcoming them into our home as our own people. And Chinese people came over and started to rape people, to kill people, and take things, take whatever they wanted, and burning down churches, burning down schools, and tearing things apart. Well, that resulted in Taiwanese people feeling very unhappy about this uh, newcomer that's supposed to be some of our own people. Imagine, imagine in your mind for a second that, let's say, you grow up with uh, with a foster parent. Let's say you got given away when you were little, and you grow up with a foster parent. Your foster parent is this guy that's really strict, sometimes kind of cruel, but at least he is very fair to you. If you obey his rules, he's very nice to you. And then one day, someone come to you and say, "Okay, we are taking your foster parent away, and we're going to reunite you with your true parents." Well, that sounds like a good thing. At first, you think, "Wow, finally, I can get back to be with my parent, my dad, real dad, my real parent." And then this real parent come into your life, and rather than being nice to you, rather than being happy to see you, this real parent start abusing you, sexually molesting you, and take your money, take your stuff. How would you feel then? That's how Taiwanese people felt when this happened. Disappointment and resentment. And this disappointment and resentment built up until in 1947, in February 27 of 1947, an event triggered what we call the 228 or February 28 incident in Taiwanese history. Thank you. Uh, anyway, so in February 27, in February 27, 1947, a Chinese official accused a Taiwanese woman of selling illegal cigarettes, and he confiscated her entire stash of merchandise without paying her a dime. When this woman protested, this official struck her on the head with the butt of his gun, knocking her down and seriously injuring her. When the nearby Taiwanese people protested at the treatment of this woman, the official fired his gun into the crowd, killing one person before escaping. Next day, Taiwanese people got together, went to the police station, went to the city hall, and demanded justice, and were ignored. And that night, these Taiwanese people decided that enough was enough. We we do not deserve to be treated like this, especially by our own people whom we openly welcome onto this island. So Taiwanese people banded together and started protesting and rioting. There were riots all over Taiwan. Rather than trying to figure out what was making Taiwanese people so unhappy, Chinese people rolled out their military and started killing people. During the entire February 28 incident, it was estimated that 28,000 Taiwanese civilians were killed by Chinese troops. And even after the event, tens of thousands of Taiwanese people were arrested and taken away and were never seen again. Some of those that were lucky enough to return talk about tortures and brainwashing at the hand of Chinese officials and military intelligence. So that brings us to where we can end today's story, because I think by this point you can clearly see why is it that Chinese people hate Japanese so much, and why is it that Taiwanese people, despite of being Chinese ourselves, hate the Chinese more than we hate the Japanese. I hope that I have not put anyone to sleep, and I hope that this topic is not too heavy for anybody. If you have questions, you can post it in the comment section, and or hit me up at johnnytiger.com, and we can talk more about this. Anyway, thank you for checking out today's Wisdom Wednesday. We'll be back tomorrow for Toy Thursday, where things will be a lot more lighthearted. For now, have a good night, stay healthy, stay strong, and 再见。